And just if we quickly talk about the number of species that we have in New Zealand, there's quite a few. The New Zealand region itself includes the Ross Dependency to the south of New Zealand, and also
Antarctica,
and also Macquarie Island and Norfolk Island, because geographically they're part of New Zealand, although they're part of Australia. And if we include all the bird species, including vagrants and migrants, we come up to 435. That also actually includes extinct species as well. So it's a great number of bird species for New Zealand, but it actually compares badly with other countries which are much larger, like Australia, where there's probably around about 700 bird species. But if we take out all those vagrants and all those...
Vagrants, could you clarify for people?
Well, a vagrant bird species might be something which unexpectedly shows up here in New Zealand. And, for example, a bird like that might be the Laughing Gull, or the Franklin's gull from North America. It actually breeds on the prairies in North America, in the Midwestern states. But we've actually found a few here in New Zealand. And most recently there was a Laughing Gull in Opotiki in the Bay of Plenty last year. So these are birds which, for some unknown reason, end up in New Zealand.
Hi, this is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings and welcome to Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth. Right around our planet, birds are essential seed dispersers for plants that provide us with food, medicine, timber and recreation. Among their qualifications, they travel long distances. They assist germination when they eat fruit by removing the pulp and scratching the seed coat. Birds mostly use their keen eyesight to find food. They use their beak and their claws to get bugs, worms, small mammals, fish, fruit, grain or nectar. They are pollinators of many flowers, which of course bring fruit into being. Birds play an important part in the natural control of insects and the dispersal of seeds. The ecological roles of birds are that, as with other native organisms, birds help maintain sustainable population levels of their prey and predators species, and after death provide food for scavengers and decomposers. And naturally, their droppings are fertilizer for new plants to grow. Many birds are important in plant reproduction through their service as pollinators or seed dispersers. So the imperative is to realize that birds are so important. They're noticing that bird sound in the morning in the dawn chorus can actually enliven and vibrate the soil to allow earthworms to help aerate the soil. There are just so many qualities that we have still yet to understand as to what birds do, as well as bring colour and melody to our world. In the radio station this morning, I have Ian McLean, who is a spokesman for Birds New Zealand. So, kia ora, Ian.
Kia ora, Tim. Thanks very much for having me here today. Much appreciated.
I'm really glad, because bird life to me is very important. I'm outside all the time. So who are Birds New Zealand and what do they do?
Birds New Zealand is the popular name for the Ornithological Society of New Zealand, and we were created in 1940, and we sort of cater for enthusiasts for birds at all levels, and that could be scientists, bird enthusiasts like myself, bird photographers, also some bird artists, and we have what we call the occasional twitcher as well, which is a very special type of birder.
Fine. I want to come back to that little twitcher. So how many New Zealanders are involved?
We have approximately 1,000 members in the organisation. There's a few more coming on all the time, and obviously we'd like to increase our membership, which we're doing a lot at the moment, trying to get lots of photographers interested in joining Birds New Zealand, because bird photography is becoming more of a good hobby that people have. So we've got around about 1,000 members at the moment.
Radio New Zealand did an article some time ago where they mentioned they're up to 31,000 people over 10 years did a study of bird life acknowledged that there was a decline in the numerous garden birds, but not necessarily tui and keruru.
That's correct. So there's a New Zealand Garden Bird Survey which has been going for quite a few years, and Birds New Zealand is actually involved in that, and a lot of our members take part. It's sort of shown up a large number of variations as far as different birds around New Zealand. For example, one of the native bird species which is declining is the silvereye, but we have found that tui numbers are increasing, and also keruru. And tui might be increasing particularly in Auckland compared to what we saw in the 1970s, because our gardens are a lot different. Back in the 1960s and 1970s we had a lot of conifer-type gardens, whereas now we have more varied plant species with more native plants. It's also probably the result of tui being a bit more robust as far as getting on with introduced bird species, and also being more predator-aware, perhaps. And also, one important reason for their increase is that lots of predator-proof sanctuaries or predator-free islands, which they can increase and then make their way to the city itself.
Yes, I think it was a New Yorker about a year ago talked a lot about the sanctuary islands, or the Ark Islands off the coast of New Zealand, that the Department of Conservation had put these endangered birds on the islands after clearing them of all pests like rats and possums, etc., and to allow the birds essentially a free go at life again.
That's right. So predator-free islands and sanctuaries are very important in New Zealand, and they sort of act as a base for birds to spread from. And if we look here in Auckland, we've got various islands which have been established for a while, like Tiritiri Matangi Island. But also most recently we've had the likes of Motutapu and Rangitoto, and a lot of birds have spread from those islands. And some have actually spread to those islands themselves. For example, interesting case was that bellbird were released on Waiheke Island. They didn't particularly like it there, so they moved to Motaihi, which is nearby, and from there they moved to Motutapu. And now if you go to Motutapu Island on the weekend, you'll see bellbird everywhere, which is quite different to Auckland City itself, where there are no bellbird.
I hear that because bellbird's got one of the most fantastic sounding voices. Just nearly passes right through you. It's such a beautiful call.
That's right, it has, and that was one of the first birds actually noticed by James Cook when he first came to New Zealand, was the call of the bellbird. But it's something we don't hear that often here in Auckland, because we don't actually really have many on the mainland. They've been extinct in our region on the mainland for around about 100 years. And they're found as far north as the Waikato and parts of the Coromandel, but they're not found in Auckland and Northland.
I've had a few years in life, and I've noticed the different numbers of birds. I mean, at present we've got a lot of doves over Auckland, and yet I didn't know about doves.
That's right.
30 years ago.
Well, doves are one of our introduced bird species, and just if we quickly talk about the number of species that we have in New Zealand, there's quite a few. The New Zealand region itself includes the Ross Dependency to the south of New Zealand, and also
Antarctica,
and also Macquarie Island and Norfolk Island, because geographically they're part of New Zealand, although they're part of Australia. And if we include all the bird species, including vagrants and migrants, we come up to 435. That also actually includes extinct species as well. So it's a great number of bird species for New Zealand, but it actually compares badly with other countries which are much larger, like Australia, where there's probably around about 700 bird species. But if we take out all those vagrants and all those
vagrants, could you clarify for people?
Well, a vagrant bird species might be something which unexpectedly shows up here in New Zealand. And for example, a bird like that might be the Laughing Gull or the Franklin's gull from North America. It actually breeds on the prairies in North America, in the Midwestern states. But we've actually found a few here in New Zealand. And most recently there was a Laughing Gull in the Opotiki in the Bay of Plenty last year. So these are birds which, for some unknown reason, end up in New Zealand.
And a gull usually has webbed feet, but it comes from the prairies?
That's correct, yes. So we have a lot of what we call inland gulls. New Zealand has its own one, which is the black-billed gull, which is one of our endemic species.
Yes, and I mean there's so many. There's kuaka, which of course is the godwit, and we have shiny cuckoo, and we have shearwaters or mutton birds. Can you tell us, there are birds that come to New Zealand seasonally?
That's right, so we have around about 50 migrant species, and those migrant species include lots of Arctic waders. So we're talking about birds like red knots and bar-tailed godwits, which might come from Siberia, in the case of the red knot. and Alaska in the case of the bar-tailed godwit. So they fly to New Zealand during the Northern Hemisphere winter, obviously to take advantage of the summer weather here, and then fly back to breed. And in the case of the bar-tailed godwit, they have a direct flight from Alaska to New Zealand, which is 12,000 kilometres. Quite incredible.
It certainly is.
And it's a non-stop flight for 8 days, and then they over summer here, which is basically them overwintering, because they're escaping the winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And then they fly back via China, so via the Yellow Sea in China, which is also bordered by North Korea and South Korea. And they make their way in sort of a two-legged migration back towards Alaska.
And I want to focus a little on this, Ian. The development in the Asian area now, more houses, more industry, more pollution. There are major challenges for these godwits going up increasingly.
That's correct. There's a lot of land reclamation, particularly in countries like South Korea. And, for example, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of reclamation around sort of Busan area in the Yellow Sea, and that really greatly affected a number of bird species. Some that actually are not that common here in New Zealand, like the great knot. It had a massive decline because it simply lost all that habitat to refuel on its journeys between its breeding and overwintering areas. And that's one of the factors which affect the number of godwits here in New Zealand. There's been a slight decline, and also a decline in the number of red knots as well.
I ran into a guy about my age who said 50 years ago he used to be down on the Manukau Harbour here in Auckland, and he said when the godwits took off, he said the sky was black. He said there were swarms. We've seen starling swarms overseas. Right. Well, he said these godwits were in their mega thousands, and here we are today, and there's just a few in isolated places.
That's right. Well, a lot of the birds now, there's a lack of areas where they can actually roost during the daytime. So they tend to be concentrated often away from urban areas. So people are seeing them a lot less often as well, but their numbers have declined. And if we look at places around Auckland where you could see a good number of godwits at the moment, one of them is Ambury Park, which is in Mangere, and the whole water care area there, which used to be a series of sewerage ponds, has actually been redeveloped into a very bird-friendly area. And there's quite a good number of shellbank roosts there for the birds to go to, where they're not disturbed by people and also not disturbed by people's pets or predators. And for that reason, if you go there, which is it's not far out of town, you'll actually see quite a few godwits. And probably at the moment there's around about 1,000 there, just returning from Alaska. But in the summer, middle of summer, there might be quite a few more. And there's some other hot spots around Auckland which are very good for godwits as well. Korokoro Miranda, which is on the Firth of Thames, is a great place. There's also a number of locations around the Manukau Harbour. Some of them are on private land.
Which is in some ways quite good.
It is in many ways quite good. There's less disturbance.
Yes.
And certainly if you're wanting to go to any of those places, you should, of course, have the permission of the landowner to go there and have a look.
Correct. Yes. And Snell's Beach, where I live, I counted about 80 the other day, and I'm trusting more will come.
That's actually a fantastic number. And one of the things which we try to do at Birds New Zealand, and I should have mentioned it before, is that we've undertaken a lot of surveys, like a lot of wading bird surveys. And we've done that since the 1950s, but sort of officially from the 1980s, we keep national records of wading birds all around New Zealand. So, for example, in Auckland here, twice a year, we count birds on the Manukau Harbour, the Waitemata Harbour, and the Kaipara Harbour. And certainly the Kaipara Harbour is one of the largest harbours in the world, and it has quite a lot of wading birds and also waterfowl as well. And twice a year we go out as volunteers and count all the birds, which is great. And it gives us a really good database. That database can be used in decisions that government might make or local government might make on development.
Very important, really, for you to have the government to be able to say, right, look, take this into consideration.
That's correct. And also DOC will use that information as well.
Department of Conservation.
Yes. Just to, any decisions they'd like to make or they recommend. So the information that we gather is used by many people in that respect. We also do what we call beach patrols, which is patrolling our coastlines. We do that once a month, and we actually collect and record the dead birds that we find on beaches. And it's certainly something that's quite hard to explain to people. Someone at my work asked what I did in the weekend, and I said that I went out and collected dead birds. They might actually look at you in a sort of strange, funny way, but it's actually something that we do, and it's very, very important. And we also do live bird counts at the same time, so you might count the number of dotterels and a number of Caspian terns or white-fronted terns that we find on the beach. And we do this in places like Muriwai Beach on the west coast and also Parkery Beach on the east coast. And that gives us great information as to what seabirds are declining in numbers and also reasons why they're perhaps perished. And they often die because of stormy weather, but they often die from food shortages as well. And things like plastic ingestion or being caught up in rubbish. And one of the things we're finding at the moment is a lot of birds are actually being found dead with fish hooks in them, or they've been wrapped up in fishing nylon.
Yes, as the population increases, 200 years ago, Auckland was just a Maori village and just trees and Waitemata, sparkling water. That was it. Now it's 1.5 million and growing, and a lot of recreational fishermen out there too.
That's correct.
This is a knock-on effect.
That's right, and we need to carefully monitor how we affect the birds in our environment. And one of the issues is bird disturbance. So, for example, people going to bird roosting sites and occasionally getting the birds to deliberately take flight. We've actually seen this when people have gone to a wading roost and waved their arms in the air to get the birds to fly. And they often do that to get great photographs. But often don't think that you're disturbing birds which may have flown 12,000 kilometres to get here. So it's quite important for us to give birds just a place where they can rest, and then we can also appreciate them from a distance without actually disturbing them. And as far as recreational fishers, we just need to be very careful in actually, when we accidentally catch a seabird, to try to do our best, our absolute best, to release it in a way where it's unharmed. Now, there are occasionally a number of fishermen which unfortunately kill the seabirds, which is kind of slightly ironic because fishermen often use seabirds to find the fish.
That's right.
They see a flock of gannets diving into the water and there's often a lot of bait fish there. So they move in there with their fishing boat and catch a few fish. Unfortunately, a certain number, a very small minority of fishermen could be careless, and occasionally we've found people that have deliberately killed seabirds. And of course, New Zealand is the seabird capital of the world. We have around about a third of all the seabirds in the world visiting or breeding in New Zealand, and it's something we don't often realise. And seabirds themselves are under quite a lot of threat, because a lot of their original breeding islands are actually now got predators on them. So they're vulnerable to predation when they're on land. And they're also fisheries bycatch as well by commercial fishermen, and then recreational fishermen can have a negative impact as well. And there's also the huge problem of plastics in the ocean. So there's a lot of plastic ingestion, and then pollution, as I mentioned before, birds getting caught up in nets and nylon. And this can really affect seabirds in particular. And when you think about some of the seabirds that we have in New Zealand, we have, for example, the greatest number of albatrosses in any country in the world. We have a huge number of cormorants, which are shags. We have at least 12 species. And we have a large number of petrels and storm petrels. And, for example, we could just think of three important ones that we have here in Auckland. In the Auckland region, we actually have 3 endemic seabirds, and they're all quite rare. So we have the black petrel, which nests on Little Barrier Island and to a great extent on Great Barrier Island. We have the New Zealand fairy tern, which is incredibly and critically endangered with only 40 birds in existence.
Only 40?
Only 40. And so it's remarkable. Yet this was a bird which used to nest around the whole coast of the North Island and also on the east coast of the South Island historically, but there's now just 40 left. And there's other birds like the New Zealand storm petrel, which was only rediscovered in 2003, and they breed on Little Barrier Island in the Hauraki Gulf. So in the Auckland region here, 3 endemic seabirds. They're endemic to New Zealand, but they're also endemic to our region, and all quite incredibly rare.
Yeah, astonishing. Yes, well, you see, you've mentioned so many birds already, and I would say so many listeners would have thought, oh gosh, I haven't really noticed those birds. And I think this is because we're moving too fast and the there's a thing called tree blindness.
Right.
And a lot of people are very tree blind today. They don't notice trees. It's just a backdrop to where they're going.
Right.
And in some cases, birds can be perceived as that too, which is so unfortunate, because one of the things that early in the morning, even before sunrise, the tui will start to call and start the day off. And then there's the dawn chorus. Now, once upon a time, it was fantastic. Evidently, Captain Cook went to Queen Charlotte Sound on his first visit here. He said the cacophony of sound was wild. Because he was inside the sound, so he's surrounded by all these trees.
That's right.
And birds. And he was astounded. Yet at the same time, he had also anchored the front of a Endeavour in the water, but had another rope going from the stern of the Endeavour to a tree, and all night long the night watchman watched rats go along that rope and escape into the bush.
That's right. So that was just the number of birds that he would have heard would have been incredible, and it would have been birds like the South Island kokako and bellbirds, tui, and New Zealand robins. So it would have been wonderful, but that's probably the second invasion of rats into New Zealand. The first lot of rats would have come with the early Polynesians, the Maori people.
Yes.
So, unfortunately, there's an incredible extinction record in New Zealand, and it's up to around about 51 species of extinct birds. And that sort of happened when people first arrived. And a lot of those birds were quite unusual. And if we look at one particular example, and it's one which is often not realised, is the Stevens Island wren, which was a small flightless passerine bird, actually. Very unusual for a passerine bird to be flightless.
What's a passerine bird?
A passerine is a small songbird. So your thrushes, your blackbirds, your riflemen, your silver-eyes, they're all passerine birds. And this one was quite unusual, and it was completely flightless and didn't fly at all. And it was found over the whole of New Zealand. But after the arrival of the Maori, it was actually killed off by the kiori, the native rat which the Maori brought with them. And it was reduced to a single population on Stevens Island, which is in the Marlborough Sound, close to the Marlborough Sounds. And it was actually killed off by the lightkeepers' cats. And around about the turn of the, I think it was around in the 1890s at that time. So the last surviving population was actually killed off by a population of cats. And some of those were kept as specimens. And that's really the only thing that we know about that bird. And that was just one of the 51 birds which have become extinct.
Well, what I can't understand is that the huia became extinct, and yet you've got huge areas around Lake Waikaremoana in the south of the Bay of Plenty, gigantic forested areas. It is sad that within that huge area we still managed to lose some of what our key birds.
That's right, and it's very sad, the case of the huia, because it was an unusual bird in that the bill of the male and the female birds were quite different. I think the male bird had a long bill, and the female had a much shorter bill, which they used in cooperation to extract food, mainly sort of grubs and boring beetles from trees. And of course, they were hunted for a while because it became popular to use their feathers. And even after they became extinct, people still wanted those feathers. And it was a sad loss for the country. And also believe that some of the bird may have been given a disease by some of our introduced birds. And it was found that they actually had ticks in sort of sucking their blood, which came with the myna bird, which was introduced around about sort of 1870. So it's possible that they, apart from hunting and predation by introduced mammals, I expect that the stoat would have had a very bad effect on them. They may have also actually died because of disease spread by an introduced bird.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yes, I can understand now. Oh, boy. So, well, look, I mean, here was New Zealand with all these bird species, And where are we today? When you look at this, you think, gee, what are we going to be leaving our children and grandchildren?
That's a very good question. Just looking at things, the good news is, for example, that the last native, or actually endemic bird, went extinct in 1970, and that was actually the bush wren. And originally we had 3 subspecies of bush wren, a North Island, a South Island, and then we had Stead's bush wren, which was found on islands around Stewart Island. And the bush wren was a kind of a bird similar to a rifleman, but just a little bit bigger, and probably spent a lot more time on the forest floor than the rifleman did. Unfortunately, it became extinct when black rats went to islands around Stewart Island in the 1960s. It was translocated, but not enough birds were translocated to a predator-free island, and it was last seen around about 1970. Now, at that time, we also saved a few other bird species, and one of the pioneers of that was Don Merton. And Don and a few of his colleagues with the Wildlife Service at that stage went to various islands and tried to save the Stewart Island snipe, which unfortunately they were unable to, which is a subspecies of New Zealand snipe. But they also fortunately saved the South Island saddleback, which today you can see on islands like Ulva Island, just off Stewart Island. And since that time, since the 1970s, not another native or endemic species has gone extinct. So we're actually holding on to some, which is great.
Well, the kakapo has been our great success story. We're not talking about it so much now, but I mean this gigantic parrot that was also on the ground was able to survive with the help of a lot of human input.
That's right. So the current population of the kakapo is currently 154 birds. So we know exactly how many birds we've got, which is something we don't know for all of our species. But with kakapo, they're of course only found on 2 predator-free islands now, which is Whenua-Hou, which is Codfish Island, off the coast of Stewart Island, and also I think Chalky Island, which is in one of the islands around Fiordland. And there is actually only one bird, Sirocco, which most of us can see, and he's a bird which is sort of taken to various nature reserves and also zoos around New Zealand. Like I've actually seen him once at Auckland Zoo quite a few years ago.
He's a socialite, is he?
That's right. Well, he was actually hand-reared by people.
Yes.
So he's been imprinted on people. And, of course, he's quite famous for trying to, have some sexual activity with the various people on TV.
Yes.
And it's quite famous for that.
Yes.
I think there was a program with Stephen Fry in it where they actually recorded it.
Oh, good.
So he very much likes people, probably more so than other kakapo.
Yes.
And is quite a character, has his own Facebook page, and is the spokesperson for Birds in New Zealand, official spokesperson.
Yes.
So it's quite a famous bird, but yes, one of only 154 in existence. And perhaps at one stage we had a low of around about 50 or 60 individuals.
That's right. That's where we really got concerned.
That's right, but there's other sort of incredible stories as well. The Chatham Island black robin went down to a total of 5 birds, and it's now at around about 250.
And the diversity of the DNA from 5?
It's a very good question, actually, but there are problems with genetics with those birds. Obviously, a lot of inbreeding, and they can get certain features, like a claw foot in the example of the black robin. So various bad traits can be passed on. But a lot of our bird species in New Zealand currently are derived from very small populations, and often very small founder populations. When a bird species is translocated from one island to another, often it's only just a very few small individuals. And an example of that might be the little spotted kiwi, which is originally found throughout the whole of New Zealand. And the population that we have at the moment is from Kapiti Island. But the number of birds that were taken there was very small. But despite that fact, they seem to have actually succeeded in growing numbers of the birds. They've been translocated to other islands like Turitu Matangi, and also Hen Island, I think, in the Hen and Chicken Islands in the Hauraki Gulf. And they're actually doing a little bit better. But we constantly need to actually shuffle birds between those populations just to keep that genetic diversity, which is already low, keep it going. And that's also done with other birds as well, like the endemic takahe. So there's a lot of shifting of birds between the populations on Motutapu, Tiri Matangi, and places in Fiordland.
Now, it's interesting how people from overseas will want to know just how many kiwi are there in New Zealand. Can you, off the top of your head, give us some sort of guideline, bearing in mind that there are many different variations of kiwi?
That's right. So there's around about 5 species at the moment. There's various subspecies as well. It's quite difficult to research and find an exact number of how many birds we have. So what we often do is we go from the ones that we know the most about, and probably the little spotted kiwi is the kiwi that we know most about, because almost all the populations are on predator-free islands. And I think the populations are around about 1,900 birds.
And once upon a time, there were tens of thousands.
Possibly millions of some birds. So, it's incredible to think what we had before. We had vast numbers of birds, and now it's reduced dramatically.
I overnighted in a tent at Trouncin Park, not far from the large kauri in New Zealand.
Right.
And there's a sign which said, "Be quiet at night and you'll be able to hear the kiwi." I'd never really managed to hear those kiwi, but from time to time come out. And this is what is one of the heartwarming things about when you can get out in the wilds and tent and camp around, that you can hear all these different birds, and particularly the nocturnal ones like the kiwi.
That's right. You have to often travel around New Zealand to get to those locations. But Trouncin Kauri Park is one of the locations where you can hear North Island brown kiwi at night, and I've heard them there myself, in addition to the ruru, which is the moorpork. And there's various places in New Zealand where you can do that. Lake Waikaremoana is another one where you can hear kiwi at night. But a really good place to go is Stewart Island.
Long way to go for northerners.
That's right. But there's a lot of birds you can see there in addition to kiwi. And one of the things I did recently when I was there is I just walked to the sports ground where they occasionally play the odd game of rugby, which is not far away from the centre of Oban. And I saw about 5 kiwi just in the field there, walking around and picking up worms. It was quite incredible. I didn't need to pay any money to especially go to an island or take a special tour. They were there, and that was quite wonderful to see.
In daylight?
Not in daylight on this occasion. It was in the sort of late evening, around about 11 o'clock at night. But they're there from an early time, probably as soon as it gets dark, which can vary throughout the year, obviously. But I was on Ulva Island, just off the coast, and we saw a kiwi in broad daylight, which seems to be a habit which is more familiar with Stewart Island kiwi themselves. They tend to be more often birds which will be seen in the daytime.
Less people, so that they're more at ease, I guess, as well.
That's probably correct, but also I think it might be the fact that they need to actually find more food because they're in a colder environment. So perhaps they need to go out a little bit earlier and look for that food.
You are listening to Ian McLean. He is the Auckland Regional Representative for Birds New Zealand, and their website is osnz.org.nz. osnz.org.nz. Yes, well, we've got kookaburras here in New Zealand, and I hear them fairly regularly myself, and I'm on the, shall we say, the mainland. They originally were brought to New Zealand by Sir George Grey, one of the early governors of New Zealand, and put on Kowal Island, and they manage after a while to be able to fly over to the mainland. They've only got about a kilometre to fly, and they do it. And I hear that Department of Conservation sees them as a problem from the standpoint that they supposedly eat food that other birds would get, so they cull them, and which disturbs me big time. But these birds, they're heartwarming when you hear them. They make a heck of a racket. Do you think that with a lot of these new bird species that are coming into the country that they do take food from other birds, Ian?
Some certainly do, but as far as the kookaburra itself, it was introduced in around about 1860, and it's only spread a very small distance during that time. You can find them here in Auckland, out in Henderson, and around Aotearoan.
Oh, good.
And then a bit further north, you can go up to Mangawhai, and you could see them up there. So they're actually in a small area. And one of the limiting factors for them in New Zealand is that we don't have any snakes. So in Australia, they eat a lot of young snakes and larger reptiles. They also are predatory on other birds, but so is the kingfisher, remarkably, in New Zealand.
It is.
The kotari will eat other birds like silver eyes, and will also eat animals like house mice, and of course lots of lizards. So the kookaburra is similar to the kingfisher, similar diet, but they probably eat bigger items. They may have an effect on some local bird species, but it hasn't really been studied. And the fact that they've only spread very slowly probably indicates that they're not a huge threat to other birds. There are other introduced species which are more of a threat. And if we just look at the number of bird species that we have that have been introduced, there's currently 35 that are breeding in New Zealand, plus a few ferals. But that's actually... It's remarkable. We're probably the country in the world with the second highest number of introduced species after Hawaii. It could be a lot worse, actually, because there were 71 other species which they tried to introduce, and those 71 species failed. And this includes birds like the tawny owl, the European robin, and certainly lots of different game birds. All sorts of grouse and pheasants were tried to introduce in New Zealand. And we look at the reasons for introducing birds. There were basically 4 reasons. The first one was just for game purposes. People wanted to shoot pheasants and quails. There was also, the second reason was nostalgia. So a lot of our European settlers came to the United Kingdom, so they brought birds with them. And that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of finches and yellow hammers and even house sparrows, song thrushes and blackbirds.
Well, it's lovely. I mean, I'm in a situation where I work up at the end of Maharangi Peninsula, and there are at least 31 bird species, and I can tell most probably 27 of them by their sound. And that fills me. I really feel good about that, but I've noticed that the skylarks are lessening. And I just trust you can tell me that there's still plenty of skylarks in New Zealand. There's
still plenty of skylarks in New Zealand, and there's probably actually a lot more of them than there are in the United Kingdom. So when we get a lot of visitors to New Zealand, they're just amazed at the number of familiar birds that we have. So blackbirds, song thrushes, skylarks, even some of the finches are much more common in New Zealand than they are in their home country. And one of the reasons for that is they're not preyed on by crows. If you go to... It's an unusual thing, but if you go to London, which I did a couple of years ago, expecting to find all these wonderful thrushes and blackbirds and different birds, small passerine birds in London, I didn't see them. All I saw was wood pigeons, feral pigeons, and crows and jays. And these are large-bodied birds, which seem to suit well to city life. And, of course, they're slightly predatory on those smaller birds. Crows eat the young and eat the eggs.
So they're looking for nests?
That's correct, yes. And of course, the birds have to also put up with mammalian predators as well, but they have to put up with a lot of bird predators, predatory birds that are going to take their nestlings and eggs. So a lot of the introduced species in New Zealand are actually doing quite well. And there was a couple of other reasons, we'll just touch on it, why birds were introduced. Some of them were introduced accidentally, so they were cage birds, and these are birds like the eastern rosella. So they're brought here as pet birds.
I see.
And unfortunately they were released.
They're cheeky, aren't they?
They are. They're very colourful birds.
Mm-hmm.
And they're
skittish, you can't get close to them?
They're very wary, but that's typical of a lot of Australian birds. So a lot of our Australian birds are used to predators, and they seem to cope with them a lot better. And, an example of that is a spur-wing plover, which is also known as the masked lapwing. They will tell you when you're too close. And you'll have no doubt about it.
Yes.
And for that reason, they're very, very successful. Just the last reason for birds being introduced was actually for pest control purposes.
Okay.
Okay, and the ironic example is the Indian myna was introduced to New Zealand to control things like insects and cattle ticks. But they actually were introduced to control those insects, but actually became a pest themselves.
They did.
Yeah, and they're quite aggressive.
Very.
And they're one of the birds which will actually predate the eggs of all sorts of birds, both introduced, native and endemic. So they're a bit of a threat. But a lot of our introduced species are actually benign. They don't really have an effect on our native birds. So if you look at song thrushes and blackbirds, they're actually occupying a niche which no native or endemic birds are actually holding. There are some which are aggressive, and that's the example was the myna, Indian myna. But there's also some which have a very negative effect, and we probably don't realise it immediately. But a classic bird is the actual mallard duck, which was introduced originally from Europe, and then later on it was reintroduced from North America. And it's become a real problem because it's actually hybridising with our native and endemic waterfowl. And our native grey duck, also known as Pacific black duck in Australia, because it's found in both Australia, New Zealand and around the Pacific, is actually now nationally critical in New Zealand because it's been hybridised out of existence by a very aggressive duck, the mallard duck, which is a real sexual predator. It will try and mate with any other duck that it can, and it will actually produce offspring with our brown teal, which is a Opotiki, which was quite an endangered endemic waterfowl. And it's actually become a real problem. And these are the birds which you quite often see in public parks, the mallard duck.
Yes.
But they're actually a motley collection in New Zealand. They can be a whole mixture of things because they've interbred with so many other duck species. And they're actually almost possibly going to make our grey duck in New Zealand extinct. The very ironic thing about it is you can actually shoot a pure grey duck. It's amazing, but it's something that's almost ignored, the plight of the bird. It's a very beautiful duck, but a duck shooter can still shoot it. Many of them don't because they know it's endangered. But I feel that it's gone under the radar. And it's actually a problem which we're exported to other countries around the Pacific. A lot of the mallard ducks which we have here in New Zealand, one of them became quite famous recently because it went to Niue Island and was known as Niue's only duck.
How did it get there?
Well, it flew there itself.
How far was that?
Well, it's a huge distance.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you,
Yeah.
but they're actually quite mobile birds. So a number of mallard duck in New Zealand have actually flown to New Caledonia, and they've become a problem there because they've interbred with the Pacific black duck there, which is the same as our grey duck. And now half the population of grey duck in New Caledonia is of a hybrid origin. So we've introduced a bird to New Zealand which has actually become a problem around the Pacific. And that's quite a concern. It's something we just don't... Not a lot of thought is put into it when we bring birds into a country. And the mallard duck was probably, with hindsight, a real mistake. I think we had enough ducks to please duck shooters with. And another example of a bad introduction is the Canada goose that was introduced to New Zealand around about 1900, and it's now very, very common. And of course farmers don't like them because they eat pasture.
Yes.
So we had a whole history of bringing introduced birds to New Zealand. Some of them had no effect really whatsoever on other local bird species, but then some of them definitely did.
What about pukekos? I've seen a lot of them lately, and they're growing in numbers, and they have very elaborate mating procedures, and particularly in large group settings. And from what I gather, you can have 20 to 30 or 40 of these pukekos together, where once upon a time that they may have only been just a couple of them. So it's very strange seeing just so many of them congregating, and I know farmers just don't like them at all.
That's right. So the pukeko is a native bird. I just have to reconfirm that they've actually been in New Zealand about 1,000 years, because some people think they've been introduced by Maori.
Yes.
And that's not the case.
Yes.
They're actually very capable of flying across the Tasman Sea.
Are they really? Because they seem to be very poor flyers when I see them flying locally. If you come close to them, And you'll see them fly, dragging their feet.
That's right.
But they can fly that far.
That's right. There's pictures. We have pictures of them with their legs tucked back behind them, and they can fly quite incredible distances because they're a member of the rail family. And a lot of these particular types of birds, like banded rail, spotless crake, they actually have a huge distribution around the world, and they can actually make their way to quite small oceanic islands. So the pukeko, or purple swamp hen, is found all the way from Spain to New Zealand and then further into Polynesia. So they're quite capable of flying. They're actually very successful in New Zealand because in a way we've actually modified the environment to suit them. So they like damp, wet pasture. They also love wetlands, and that have been modified where we've taken all the vegetation around the wetland. And if you go to a wetland which is in its original state, like recently I went to one on Great Barrier Island, there are pukeko there, but in much smaller numbers. Where you have a wetland or a pond with pasture or parkland around it, there's a lot more, because that suits them. They love that grass. They also live in clans, so they look after each other. Yes. And an unfortunate thing about it is they're quite predatory. So they will kill ducklings.
Yes.
They will kill other small nestling birds. And a lot of our birds have a struggle to cope with them. One of those bird species which does struggle to cope with them is the Opotiki, which is the brown teal. A lot of the ducklings are killed by pukeko, and that happens a lot on places like Great Barrier Island. So one of the things we suggest to limit the number of pukeko is to actually plant lots of native vegetation around wetlands. Yes. And that gives the other birds a bit of a buffer. Mm-hmm. It also just reduces their numbers a little bit and allows other birds to cope with them. And we also very much recommend that you don't feed them.
Yes, well, ducks are a huge problem. Seagulls are a huge problem. I have heard that the red-billed seagull numbers have gone from about 70,000 down to about 30,000 over the last 30 years. And that's concerning if this is true, bearing in mind the difficulty in getting all this information together.
That's right. So the numbers of red-billed gulls have actually decreased from around about 40,000 pairs back in the 1960s to just recently we did a survey. It's one of the things that Birds New Zealand members do, is that we have a survey of a national species, and we found that there was around about 27,000 pairs of red-billed gulls in New Zealand. But a lot of the colonies have decreased rapidly from what they were before. So just in the Hauraki Gulf off the Mokahinau Islands, there was a population there which had a huge crash. And we think possibly the reason for that is overfishing of bait fish and also things like krill, which they used to feed on. So their numbers have decreased quite rapidly.
There's so many factors involved, and there's so few people on the ground to be able to get the information and the data. Now, one thing I've noticed, Ian, is that there's a lot of what you call English names for these birds when they all would have had Maori names. And is there any particular reason?
Not specifically any particular reason. I think a lot of the settlers, when they came to New Zealand,
knew them from elsewhere.
No, I think they just called... The unfortunate thing, a lot of the English names for New Zealand birds are rather bad. There wasn't an incredible amount of thought put behind them. And for example, we have a blue duck, which is the Theo. We have the grey duck, which is actually brown.
Yeah. We
have the brown teal, which is the Opotiki. We have they call it the black duck, which is the New Zealand scaup. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you the Maori name for it. But a lot of the Maori names are fantastic. With Maori names, there's a lot of variation in particular areas as well. So there's Kereroo and then there's Kokapu. So it's just, I think a lot of the pioneers, when they came to New Zealand, or the colonists, came up with rather unthought of names. I mean, I find it embarrassing that we call the ruru the moorpork. The moorpork is just one of its calls.
Yes.
In Australia, it's called the boobook owl, because boobook is kind of the call it makes in Australia. I sometimes just feel that we didn't put a lot of thought into the English names of our birds, and the duck species that I just mentioned before are classic examples.
Well, yes. Well, I think early New Zealand, going back to the 1800s, there were a lot of introduced animals, birds and particularly mammals, which became pests because there was no thought, and nobody realised that when you put a possum into a country like New Zealand where there are no carpet snakes or pythons, that they're going to balloon out to 75 million of these as of today. And so in hindsight we've learnt a lot. What can we do for our future?
We can keep learning from our hindsight and keep that in mind constantly, and just sort of always review why we shouldn't just automatically bring new species to the country. But the thing we need to do, obviously most of all, is predator control and pest control. And quite often we use the term predator-free New Zealand. I think sometimes we should be saying pest-free New Zealand, because of course we also have our own native predators. And that's sometimes the reason why people start shooting Australasian harriers, because they're seen as being a predator, which they are. But obviously pest control is very, very important, and we should keep that up as much as we can, and use the tools that are available. Trapping is great. At the moment we're using 1080, which until something better comes along we need to probably continue using. And just keep up that great work by a lot of volunteers, and also by people in government and government departments. So,
from the support side of things, I'm very much aware. I can listen to a bird where I work at a holiday park, and I'll turn around to somebody and say, "Did you hear that?" And I hear what? And I said, "Oh, did you hear that?" Well, in this case, quite often it's the kookaburra.
Right.
But I will say, "Well, listen to that bird there. That's a kautare." And they think, "Oh, didn't hear it at all." So how do we get people more involved, Ian? Because, bird life and bird sound, particularly the dawn chorus and the evening chorus, it's wonderful.
I think we just need to make people much more aware of the birds that we have, and often tell their story. So one of the things that Birds New Zealand do here locally in Auckland is we have lots of guided walks. So we take people on guided walks to Ambury Park and Cornwall Park, and we tell them about the birds that we have. And quite often people are absolutely amazed. A lot of the locals don't realise some of the behaviours of the birds, or don't realise what we have. But we also find a lot of the people that are coming on those walks are actually new immigrants to the country. And they tend to sometimes be even more keen to find out than a lot of us locals are. I think a lot of us sometimes go around with our eyes closed and our ears shut, and we don't really realise what's around us. And one of the things we like to push as Birds New Zealand is that bird watching is actually a very relaxing habit. It's a great leisure activity, and it gets you actually going out into the environment and going for a hike and going for a walk, and actually perhaps doing some work as well, perhaps monitoring the birds in your area or doing some conservation work. But it's also just incredibly relaxing, and quite often just sitting on the back porch listening to a song thrush or listening to a tui is actually a very good way of just chilling out, especially after a hard day's work. And it's something that I do quite often, and I think it's something we very much recommend to people as a way of relaxation.
Yeah, fantastic, because I just love bird sound. Other than, say, Forest and Bird and Department Conservation, and you've got Birds New Zealand, what can people do with Birds New Zealand? How can they contact you and make a commitment?
Well, they can contact us on our website, and also contact me directly by email, or actually join our Facebook page as well. So we have a Facebook group here in Auckland just called Birds Auckland. We share lots of information about birds. A lot of photographers put their photos on them, and quite often tell us stories about those birds, where you can see them and where you can find them.
And we've got children. Children are our future. Some good education programs. You said you put out a magazine or a small journal a couple of times a year with data on, so that people can learn a little bit more.
So we put out a year 4 magazines called Birds New Zealand. It's basically just birding news and information, and it also follows up on the studies that we do. So we have what we call a lot of citizen science, where our members can undertake a lot of survey work And it might be wader bird counting, which we do twice a year, or beach patrols, or taking part in the New Zealand Garden Bird Survey, or just reporting any rare sightings that they make, or interesting behaviour. And that's a good way of becoming part of the organisation. And we also have a small group called the Young Birders of New Zealand, which are basically kids aged around about sort of 8 years old to about 18. And they get involved in doing this work. And a lot of them actually go on what they call birdathons, where they look for the bird life around a certain part of the country and record all the birds that they see. And it's also a good organisation for the future of birding in New Zealand, because it's a hobby that we'd like to continue. And we're certainly seeing a little bit of a growth in the numbers of people that are interested, but would like to see a lot more. So we'll be out there sort of pushing our name a little bit more, and also getting people involved. And as I said before, one of the things we do is guided walks, and people are welcome to come along to those. They're often advertised locally in newspapers.
And your website?
The website has a lot of great information. It's going to be updated soon. There's also another good website which you can look at just for birds, information on birds in New Zealand, which Birds New Zealand have had a part in creating, and it's called newzealandbirdsonline.org, and it's called newzealandbirdsonline.org. And it's very good to look at. It shows all the species of birds that we have in New Zealand. And if you've seen something and you're not sure what it is, it's a very good website to look at and get that great information about the bird you've just seen or may have seen.
Good. Now, a twitcher.
A twitcher. Okay, it's a very, very long story, but a twitcher is a person who will travel, for example, the whole length of New Zealand or the whole length of the country to see a vagrant bird. And it's something that probably a term that became known in the 1950s, where there used to be people in the UK who used to travel the length of the country in the middle of winter time on a motorcycle in the freezing cold, and they'd arrive at a destination and ask to see the bird, but they'd be twitching with the cold while they were there. And it just was kind of a word which stuck. But most of us like to be known just as birders.
Excellent. Ian, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your story. There's so many other... It's a huge subject.
It is. It's a massive subject, and it's something we could talk more about at some stage for sure. Yes. And you could even go down to sort of species level and talk about certain birds. And there's a couple of things we probably didn't have time to talk about today, but I very much appreciate us to come along.
This is fantastic. Cheers, brother.
Thank you very much.
That was Ian McLean of Birds New Zealand, and the website is osnz.org.nz. osnz.org.nz. Decide to network. Use every letter you write, every conversation you have, every meeting you attend, every email you send. And remember, even Facebook. To tweet and to express your fundamental beliefs and dreams. Affirm to others the vision of the world you want. Network through thought. Network through action. Network through love. Network through the spirit. You are the center of a network. You are the center of the world. You are a free, immensely powerful source of life and goodness. Affirm it. Spread it. Radiate it. Think day and night about it, and you will see a miracle happen. The greatness of your own life in a world of big powers, media and monopolies, but of 7.6 billion individuals, networking is the new freedom, the new democracy, a new transparency, and a new form of wholeness and happiness. This originated by Dr. Robert Muller, Chancellor of the World Peace University in Costa Rica, Central America. I invite you to be able to come to greenplanetfm.com, where we have over 400 interviews in our database, which you can readily download and listen to be able to inspire yourself to become the change you want to see in the world and become involved in caring for your children and grandchildren's future. We are also on Facebook, on Green Planet FM, and ourplanet.org. Please come and love us. This is Tim Lynch.
And or Lisa Eyre. And Liz Gunn.
In the spirit of Aroha, wishing you a wonderful week. We look forward to being with you next week. I say Kia kaha and haere rā.